So I will just say a few words about validating the results of your qualitative study. As we discussed before, in a quantitative study, you don't really have to validate your results because the analytic procedures are standardized. You press a button in a software package and there is a sequence of calculations that happens. It's always the same. In case of a qualitative research, it is up to us to come up with a list of themes that we want to extract from those texts. And it's up to us to code all those texts. And this is a long process. And it's also a creative process because you engage your intelligence, you engage your intuition, you engage your knowledge about this reality. And also in the process, you are trying to separate your assumptions and your pre-existing ideas about this reality from what you can actually see reflected in these texts. And in this process, it is also very easy, it is also very tempting to see what you want to see instead of seeing what is out there. This is why in qualitative studies we use a bunch of strategies to prove that we see what is really there and not what we want to see. How can we prove this? A prominent methodologist in this qualitative field, Lucy Yardley, she has proposed several criteria of a good qualitative study and several strategies that you can use in order to ensure that those criteria are met. So a qualitative study, it's first of all, it's sensitive to context. It is clear what kind of theory it is based on. It is clear what kind of assumptions the researcher had or what kind of intentions the researcher had. And also, it is clear in what context did the participants interact with the researcher and what kind of values, what kind of socio-cultural background did the participants have that could influence not only their answers, but also their position towards the researcher, the researcher's position towards them, and basically what was their relationships as human beings. This is the context, which is very important. So we not only work with the text, of course we analyze the text, but also we are aware in which situation was this text obtained. And sometimes this context can completely change the understanding of the text. For example, Anna Akhmatova, a Russian poet, when she was persecuted by Stalin, and basically her poems were banned, and at some point foreign journalists asked her, so what do you think about this decision of the party to stop publishing your poems? And she answered, I totally agree with this decision. Because obviously she could not answer anything else. She wouldn't have been alive. But this answer does not contain this knowledge. It's in the context. And it's up to you to make this context evident. The second criterion is commitment. You spend a lot of time with your data. You spend a lot of time with your research topic so that you have an idea of how it works. Rigor. Your data analysis is complete and rigorous. You spend a lot of time thinking about those categories and refining those categories and doing potentially several rounds of coding to make sure that the final categories you have are really the best. Transparency. Every aspect, every step of your data analysis needs to be documented. So if you have a certain conclusion in your or a certain interpretation in your resulting description, a reader needs to be able to trace where exactly this comes from. Of course, it's not part of your paper or research report, but you need to have this structured body of qualitative data that you can use to prove that your conclusions are actually based on the data. Coherence, the fit between a research question and a philosophical perspective, and also the methods of analysis. This is very important because as we discussed at the beginning, the quantitative approach tries to generalize, and qualitative methods are not really good for this. So if you want to generalize and to establish the validity of your generalization, maybe it's better to use some kind of statistical approach. In qualitative methods, we adopt this qualitative perspective of listening to our participants, of giving space to their subjectivity. So this is our philosophical and epistemological position. And it needs to be in line with your intentions and with your research question. And finally, impact and importance. What are the implications of these findings? What do they tell us about human condition that might be important for the future improvement of social institutions or changing of social practices? So this is also an important criterion. What kind of specific strategies can we use to validate our qualitative data? There is a good chapter by Lucy Yardley in Smith's textbook where she describes them all. I'll just briefly describe them. Triangulation is the most often used approach. What is triangulation? Imagine a triangle. It has two ends, and then the lines converge on the other side. Triangulation means that using two different kinds of data, using different sources, you come up to the same conclusion. Or the picture of reality that you come up with is consistent with the positions of different individuals. And there are different ways you can triangulate. For example, you did a qualitative study and then you look for existing quantitative findings to find out if your conclusions are in line with those findings. Or you might use a multi-subject perspective. For example, in your study, you did an interview with teachers about the difficulties in teaching, but you are not sure whether what teachers are telling you about reflects the reality. So you might actually conduct an interview with students to find out how they see this, how they see the same situations, and then you can triangulate, and so on. Expert agreement, especially in content analytic studies, several independent experts can code your data, all of it or some part of it, and then you can show that actually there is a good expert agreement. In phenomenological studies, you can simply show your analysis to another person to ask them to kind of read it and think if the themes are labeled rightly, if the interpretations are correct, and so on. Participant feedback. Sometimes we can actually produce our research report or a draft version of our research report and come to our participants asking them, okay, so this is what I extracted from the interview with you. Do you think this kind of captures what's really important, or there is something missing in my report? This is a little bit radical strategy, but in some situations it can be useful. So depending on the context, it might be applicable or completely unapplicable. Again, it's up to you to decide. There is no single recipe. Disconfirming case analysis. In quantitative study, if a person is not the same as everyone else, we say, oh, he or she is an outlier. Let's exclude that person from our sample because maybe there are different processes behind and they are spoiling our nice general tendency. However, in qualitative studies, it's a completely opposite perspective. If you have talked to 10 people and 9 of them tell you one thing, but the 10th person tells you a completely different story, you must try to understand why. Why is this person telling you a completely different story? What's so special about this person? And this is how many interesting theories have been born. For example, Abraham Maslow, when he came up with his self-actualization theory, he started by observing his teachers. He started by observing some people who were not the same as everyone else. And that's how he came up with this idea of self-actualization as the higher or more advanced step of personality development. And there are only, according to Maslow, around 2% of people who are self-actualized. Maybe nowadays it's more, but at least in Maslow's time. So if he did a qualitative study, probably in 98% of all cases he would get responses that would be pretty much the same. But there is a little piece of gold somewhere in the sand, or this disconfirming case can be a treasure which can reveal to you something very interesting about the reality that you're studying. Paper trail, the necessity to have all steps of your analysis documented, and for example, if you have a master's thesis and it's a qualitative IPA study, and the reviewers ask you, okay, how did you come up with those conclusions? You can easily say, okay, here's a folder with 500 pages of all the transcripts, and then all the draft themes, and then all the final themes. So please take a look if you don't believe me. And finally, reflexivity. Reflexivity is also very special to qualitative studies, because in qualitative studies we analyze with our own personality, and in this process we cannot be completely value free. We cannot avoid sometimes imposing our assumptions on the data that we see. For example, you might be conducting a study about some family abuse, and you've experienced maybe something like this in your life. So you might have a very strong emotional reaction. And as a result, you might not be able to see what your participants are telling you in a completely clear and neutral way. So the goal is not to pretend that you did not have this experience. The goal is to reflect on your own individual experience concerning your research question, to make this experience evident, to kind of think of how it could have affected the way you see it in the responses of your participants, and to reflect on how you could prevent your personal biases from interfering with your conclusions, or from biasing the picture of reality that you reconstruct based on participant responses. Again, in qualitative studies, we don't make the assumption that our research can be neutral with respect to values. We always have values that are important to us, that influence our decisions. They are what makes us human. They are our joint, shared social context. And we need to make those values clear in our research and also in our life. Okay, so this was our little excursion into qualitative methods. There are quite a bunch of chapters that you can explore if you're interested in a specific method. Again, this is completely optional, probably only in case if you want to conduct a qualitative study. And it's a very interesting and it's a great endeavor. It's very work intensive, however. So if your study is qualitative, make sure that you allow much more time for this. Make sure that you start your data collection very much in advance, and that you allow a lot of time for analysis, because it's always a pain to see situations when a person has collected too many interviews and has not been able to analyze them. So careful planning is essential here. And if you want to conduct a qualitative study, I can wish you good luck, and see you at our next lecture on mixed method studies.